The cruelest wounds are often the ones no one else believes they can see. Grace Carter lowered her eyes as another burst of laughter echoed across the grand ballroom, but she refused to let a single tear fall. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of elegantly dressed guests, while a string quartet played soft classical music that somehow made the silence around her feel even heavier. She moved carefully between marble columns, carrying a silver tray of untouched champagne glasses, her black housekeeping uniform perfectly pressed despite the 12-hour shift already weighing on her shoulders. Every detail inside the luxurious estate spoke of wealth without limits, from the hand-painted ceilings to the imported Italian marble beneath her polished shoes, yet none of it made the room feel warmer. To many of the guests, she was invisible until they wanted something. Then she became impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," one man said with a smile that never reached his eyes. Grace stopped immediately. "Yes, sir." He looked toward the small group surrounding him before speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Do people ever remember your name? Or do they just call you Maid?" Quiet laughter rippled through the circle. Grace answered with the same calm professionalism she had practiced for years. "My name is Grace, sir." Another guest chuckled as he gently lifted a champagne glass from her tray. "Grace, that is ironic." More laughter followed. Someone whispered another comment she could not quite hear, and several people smiled without bothering to hide it. Grace simply nodded once and continued walking. She had learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant refusing to give humiliation the reaction it expected. Near the center of the ballroom, she paused beside a long table decorated with white roses, carefully replacing empty serving plates with fresh ones. Around her, conversations flowed effortlessly about private jets, investment deals, luxury vacations, and charity galas. The same people who proudly spoke about generosity barely acknowledged the employees making the evening possible. Grace quietly adjusted a folded linen napkin that had slipped out of place. An elderly dishwasher passing through the service entrance smiled at her. "You always fix what nobody notices." Grace smiled back. "Sometimes the little things matter most." He nodded before disappearing into the kitchen. Moments later, a young server accidentally brushed against Grace while carrying a tray of desserts. One small plate tipped onto the tablecloth, leaving only a faint stain no larger than a hand. Before either employee could replace it, one of the wealthy guests sighed dramatically. "This is exactly why standards keep falling." His voice carried across the room. Several heads turned. Grace immediately apologized. "I am very sorry, sir. We will have this cleaned right away." The guest waved one dismissive hand as though brushing away an inconvenience. "Do not apologize to me. Apologize to everyone whose evening you interrupted." Grace stood perfectly still. The young server beside her looked terrified, but Grace gently touched his arm, silently telling him everything would be all right. She accepted responsibility even though the accident had not been hers. The ballroom gradually returned to conversation, yet the weight of countless silent glances remained fixed upon her. She quietly collected the stained linen and turned toward the service hallway, determined to finish her work with the same quiet pride she had carried into every shift. Just before she reached the doorway, the massive front entrance slowly opened. Every conversation faded almost instantly. The musicians lowered their instruments. Even longtime staff members instinctively straightened their posture. Grace did not look up immediately, believing another important guest had arrived. But when she finally lifted her eyes, she noticed every person in the ballroom staring toward the entrance with sudden respect. A tall man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stepped inside, with calm blue eyes and effortless authority. He did not greet the guests first. He did not acknowledge the lavish decorations surrounding him. Instead, his attention settled on only one person in the entire room. It settled on Grace, standing alone with quiet dignity and unmistakable sadness still hidden behind her composed smile. Grace instinctively lowered her gaze again and reached for the folded linen in her hands, hoping to disappear back into the quiet rhythm of her work before anyone noticed the embarrassment still lingering on her face. But the silence spreading across the ballroom refused to let the moment pass. The man standing near the entrance did not move immediately. He simply observed. His calm blue eyes traveled across the room, taking in every expression, every uneasy smile, every employee standing perfectly still beside polished marble walls. The atmosphere had changed completely. Only seconds earlier the ballroom had been filled with effortless laughter and expensive conversation. Now the room felt suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Grace finally looked up once more, not because she wanted attention, but because she sensed everyone else was watching the same man. Vincent Moretti walked forward with measured confidence, greeting no one along the way. Several influential business owners nodded respectfully. Others stepped aside without being asked. He acknowledged none of them. Instead, he stopped only a few feet away from Grace. She immediately lowered the tray she was carrying and spoke with quiet professionalism. "Good evening, sir. Welcome." Vincent looked at the folded linen in her hands before meeting her eyes. There was no judgment in his expression, only careful observation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Grace wondered whether he had witnessed the uncomfortable exchange moments earlier or had simply arrived at an unfortunate time. Around them, dozens of guests remained unusually quiet, pretending to resume conversations while listening closely. Vincent noticed the faint redness around Grace's eyes that she had worked so hard to hide. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of sadness most people overlooked because it had learned how to wear a polite smile. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "What happened here?" No one answered. Grace immediately offered the explanation she believed would end the tension. "Everything is fine, sir. There was a small accident, but it has already been taken care of." Vincent continued looking at her, as though weighing every word against everything her eyes refused to say. He spoke again, this time even more quietly. "I was not asking about the tablecloth." The sentence settled heavily over the ballroom. Grace instinctively looked down at the polished floor. She had spent years learning how to protect difficult people from awkward moments, because keeping peace was often easier than defending herself. "Please," she said softly. "Everyone is here to enjoy the evening." Vincent remained perfectly still. Then he asked the single question that seemed to stop time itself. "Who did this to you?" The words were neither loud nor threatening. They carried no anger. Yet every conversation in the ballroom disappeared completely. Somewhere in the distance, one violinist slowly lowered his instrument. A waiter froze beside the dining tables. Even the guests who had mocked Grace only moments earlier suddenly found the crystal glasses in their hands strangely fascinating. No one wanted to meet Vincent's eyes. Grace felt every face in the room turning toward her, waiting for an answer she had no intention of giving. "No one did anything," she replied gently. "It was simply a misunderstanding." Vincent never looked away. "That is not what I asked." Grace hesitated, searching for words that would protect everyone involved, including those who had shown her so little kindness. Before she could answer again, the young server she had defended earlier slowly stepped forward from the edge of the ballroom. His hands trembled slightly as he looked first at Grace and then at Vincent. Grace immediately gave the smallest shake of her head, silently asking him to remain quiet. The young man understood her kindness, but he also understood something else. For the first time that evening, someone important wanted the truth more than comfort. He took a careful breath, lifted his eyes toward Vincent, and quietly said, "Sir, I saw everything." The young server swallowed hard as every eye in the ballroom shifted toward him. Grace's quiet plea had been clear, but so had the question Vincent had asked. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the soft crackling of candles arranged across the dining tables. The young man finally gathered enough courage to continue. "Miss Carter was helping me," he said carefully. "I nearly dropped the dessert tray. She stepped in before anyone else noticed, and she accepted the blame even though it was my mistake." A heavy silence settled over the room. The server glanced toward the guests standing near the center of the ballroom. Instead of letting her explain, several people began making jokes about her. They laughed at her name. They treated her like she did not belong here. She never argued back. She only kept apologizing. Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment, wishing the conversation would end. She had spent years believing that quiet endurance protected everyone involved, including herself. Drawing attention to humiliation only made it linger longer. Vincent listened without interrupting. His expression never changed, yet those who knew him understood that his silence carried far more weight than raised voices ever could. One of the businessmen forced an uncomfortable smile and took a cautious step forward. "I believe this has become a misunderstanding," he said politely. Everyone was simply enjoying the evening. No harm was intended. Another guest nodded quickly. It was harmless conversation. We certainly did not mean to offend anyone. Vincent slowly turned his attention toward them. He did not accuse them. He did not challenge their explanation. Instead, he asked a simple question. Did anyone here ask for her name before tonight? The men exchanged uncertain glances. None of them answered. Vincent looked back toward Grace. How long have you worked here? Almost 6 years, sir, she replied softly. 6 years, Vincent repeated. And after 6 years, some people in this room still believe your profession is your identity. Grace remained silent. She had never expected anyone to defend her, especially not in a room filled with people whose influence reached across the city. Vincent walked slowly toward one of the banquet tables where photographs from previous charity events had been displayed inside elegant silver frames. Hundreds of smiling faces filled those pictures. Wealthy donors, community leaders, award ceremonies celebrating generosity and compassion. He studied them quietly before speaking again. It is interesting how easily people celebrate kindness when there is a camera nearby. No one responded. His words were calm, but each sentence seemed to remove another layer of comfort from the room. Grace noticed something she had not expected. The elderly dishwasher who had smiled at her earlier was standing quietly beside the kitchen entrance. Several cooks had gathered behind him. Housekeepers, servers, valets, and kitchen staff had all stopped working for just a moment. None of them looked afraid. They simply watched in complete silence, perhaps because for the first time someone powerful had paused long enough to see the people who usually disappeared into the background. Vincent turned once more toward Grace. You protected someone else when it would have been easier to protect yourself. Grace offered a gentle smile. He is young. He should not lose confidence over one accident. Vincent nodded almost imperceptibly, as though confirming something only he understood. Then he looked toward his longtime executive assistant, Daniel Brooks, who had remained quietly near the entrance since the moment Vincent arrived. Without raising his voice or changing his expression, Vincent gave a single instruction that sounded almost ordinary. Daniel, he said, before the sun comes up tomorrow, I would like to know every name of every person who believed respect was optional tonight. Daniel answered with one calm word. Understood. No one questioned the instruction. Daniel simply inclined his head once before quietly stepping away, already making discreet phone calls as he disappeared beyond the ballroom doors. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, yet an unmistakable tension settled over every guest. Those who had laughed only minutes earlier suddenly found themselves wondering whether a careless remark could follow them far beyond the walls of the estate. Vincent showed no sign of satisfaction. He had not come to embarrass anyone, nor had he spoken to display authority. He merely believed that respect should never depend on someone's title, paycheck, or place at the table. Grace remained standing beside the service station, still holding the folded linen in her hands. She felt dozens of eyes resting on her, and somehow that attention felt even more uncomfortable than the humiliation she had quietly endured before. She stepped toward Vincent with calm composure. Sir, she said softly, I appreciate your kindness, but I do not want anyone to lose opportunities because of me. Vincent turned to face her completely. Do you believe this is because of you? Grace hesitated. I never wanted to become the reason for anyone's problems. Vincent nodded thoughtfully before answering. You are not the reason. Every decision has a consequence. Tonight, people simply introduced themselves through their choices. His words carried no anger, only certainty. Grace lowered her eyes, reflecting on them in silence. Throughout her life, she had believed that forgiveness required pretending nothing had happened. She had convinced herself that swallowing pain protected peace. Yet standing before Vincent, she realized there was another kind of peace, one built not on silence, but on simple accountability. Nearby, the estate manager slowly approached with visible uneasiness. He had overseen hundreds of events inside the mansion and prided himself on flawless service. Yet tonight he felt he had failed the very people responsible for creating that experience. Mr. Moretti, he said respectfully, I should have stepped in sooner. The responsibility belongs to me. Vincent looked at him for a moment before replying. Leadership is measured by the people who have the least power, not the most. The manager quietly lowered his head. He understood the lesson immediately. Without another word, he turned toward the staff gathered near the service entrance and personally thanked each employee for their work, something many of them admitted later had never happened before. The atmosphere inside the ballroom slowly shifted. Conversations resumed, but they sounded different now. Laughter became quieter. Greetings became warmer. Several guests who had ignored the staff all evening suddenly addressed servers by name after reading their small name badges. Others awkwardly offered polite smiles to employees they had previously walked past without acknowledgement. Grace noticed the change, but remained cautious. Respect offered because of fear rarely lasted. Respect rooted in understanding was something entirely different. As the evening continued, Vincent attended the charity gala exactly as planned. He greeted donors, spoke with community leaders, and thanked organizers for supporting local educational programs. Watching him from a distance, Grace was surprised by how ordinary he appeared despite the extraordinary influence everyone attributed to him. He listened more than he spoke. He shook every employee's hand with the same courtesy he offered distinguished guests. Hours later, as the final visitors prepared to leave and the chandeliers began to dim, Grace collected the last empty glasses from the ballroom floor. She believed the night had finally come to an end. She had no way of knowing that while the city slept, Daniel Brooks was quietly piecing together every conversation, every witness, and every decision made inside that ballroom. And by sunrise, the lives of several powerful men would begin changing not because of revenge, but because respect, once ignored, had finally found someone willing to defend it. The following morning arrived with the quiet confidence of an ordinary business day, yet beneath the calm skyline of the city, conversations were unfolding that no newspaper would report. Grace woke before sunrise, just as she always did. She prepared a simple breakfast, ironed her housekeeping uniform, and caught the same city bus that had carried her to work for nearly 6 years. She expected another long shift filled with polished silver, spotless floors, and unnoticed acts of service. The previous evening already felt like something she wanted to leave behind. She hoped the uncomfortable attention had ended when the ballroom lights went dark. What Grace did not know was that Daniel Brooks had spent the entire night meeting with attorneys, executives, foundation directors, and business partners connected to Vincent Moretti's organization. No threats had been made. No voices had been raised. Every discussion centered on one principle. Character mattered. Respect mattered. Partnerships reflected values. Shortly after 8 o'clock, several influential companies quietly reviewed pending contracts involving guests who had attended the gala. Invitations to exclusive charity boards were placed on hold pending internal evaluations. 2 consulting agreements scheduled to be finalized that afternoon were postponed indefinitely. A luxury development project unexpectedly selected a different investor after what executives described only as a review of organizational culture. None of the decisions violated policy. Every choice remained completely within the authority of the organizations involved. Yet by mid-morning, phones across the city were ringing with unusual urgency. Men who had entered the ballroom overflowing with confidence the night before now found themselves asking the same question. What had changed overnight? Inside the estate, employees noticed something equally surprising. The same guests who regularly ignored service staff were calling the event coordinator to request the names of employees they wished to thank personally. Several sent handwritten apologies to the hospitality team without mentioning the real reason behind their sudden humility. The estate manager quietly placed those letters inside the staff office, encouraging everyone to read them if they wished. Grace glanced at the growing stack, but chose not to open a single envelope. She believed apologies only carried meaning when they came from genuine understanding, not fear of consequences. During her lunch break, she sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking the small employee garden behind the estate. It was the one peaceful place where she could hear birds instead of crystal glasses and expensive conversations. The elderly dishwasher joined her with 2 cups of coffee. He smiled gently before handing one to her. "People are acting differently today," he said. Grace looked toward the kitchen entrance where supervisors were thanking employees by name and asking whether anyone needed assistance. "I noticed," she answered quietly. "Do you think it will last?" The older man reflected for a moment before replying. "Respect that comes from fear fades quickly. Respect that begins with reflection has a chance." Grace nodded thoughtfully. She hoped he was right. Across town, Daniel entered Vincent's office carrying a single leather folder. It contained no dramatic reports, only carefully documented facts, eyewitness accounts, and summaries of business relationships. Vincent reviewed each page without rushing. When he reached the final document, he closed the folder and looked through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Daniel finally broke the silence. Everything has been handled exactly as instructed. Vincent remained quiet for another moment before asking one question. And Grace Carter? Daniel smiled faintly. She still believes none of this is about her. Vincent looked back toward the skyline, where morning sunlight reflected from hundreds of glass buildings stretching across the horizon. Good, he replied softly. Because this was never about one woman. It was about reminding an entire city that dignity is never a privilege reserved for the powerful. Grace finished her shift later that afternoon, believing the strange events surrounding the gala would slowly fade into memory, but the city seemed determined to remind her otherwise. As she walked through the employee parking lot toward the bus stop, people who had barely acknowledged her before suddenly greeted her with warm smiles. The head chef thanked her for years of dependable work. The estate manager personally opened the staff entrance door for her and wished her a safe trip home. Even the young server whose mistake she had protected seemed more confident than he had the previous evening. Grace appreciated every gesture, yet something about the sudden kindness left her unsettled. She had never wanted special treatment. All she had ever hoped for was to be treated with ordinary respect. The following morning, she arrived at work to find a sealed envelope waiting inside her employee locker. Her name was written neatly across the front in elegant handwriting. Assuming it contained another schedule adjustment or workplace notice, she opened it without hesitation. Inside rested a simple cream-colored invitation embossed with silver lettering. It requested her presence for breakfast at Vincent Moretti's private residence at 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. No explanation accompanied the invitation. At the bottom of the card, only one handwritten sentence appeared. Thank you for reminding us what quiet strength looks like. Grace read the sentence twice before carefully placing the invitation back into the envelope. Throughout the day, she wondered whether someone had made a mistake. Employees like her did not receive invitations to private breakfasts with men whose names appeared in financial magazines and charitable foundations across the country. During her afternoon break, she showed the invitation to the elderly dishwasher. He adjusted his glasses and smiled. Sometimes life opens a door that hard work alone could never reach. Grace looked uncertain. What if he only feels sorry for me? The older man shook his head gently. Pity speaks loudly. Respect usually arrives in silence. His words stayed with her long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, across town, Vincent sat inside a sunlit conference room overlooking the river as executives discussed quarterly investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Charts covered large digital screens, and advisors debated market forecasts with careful precision. Vincent listened patiently before closing one folder. Before we approve any partnership, he said calmly, I want every leadership team evaluated not only for financial performance, but also for how they treat the people no one is watching. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. One finally asked, Is that now part of our investment policy? Vincent answered without hesitation. It always should have been. No one argued further. His decision immediately became company policy. By Friday evening, Grace had almost convinced herself not to attend the breakfast. She ironed her modest navy blue dress anyway, telling herself it was simply out of courtesy. She spent nearly an hour deciding whether the outfit appeared appropriate before quietly laughing at herself in the bedroom mirror. Her mother had once told her that character always dressed better than expensive clothing. Remembering those words brought a peaceful smile to her face. Early Saturday morning, she boarded the city bus carrying nothing except her small handbag and the invitation carefully folded inside. As the bus climbed the winding road leading toward the lakeside district, elegant homes gradually replaced busy apartment buildings. When she finally stepped off at the last stop, a black luxury sedan was already waiting beside the sidewalk. Daniel Brooks stood beside the open passenger door with his usual calm expression. Good morning, Miss Carter, he said warmly. Mr. Moretti has been looking forward to meeting you properly. Grace looked from the waiting car to the quiet lake beyond the trees, realizing that whatever awaited her beyond those gates would become another chapter of a story she had never imagined could belong to someone like her. Grace thanked Daniel as he opened the car door, then settled quietly into the leather seat, while the sedan glided along the winding road beside the lake. Morning sunlight shimmered across the calm water, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe without thinking about polished floors, silver trays, or whispered laughter. Daniel drove without rushing, respecting the peaceful silence before speaking. "Mr. Moretti rarely invites people to his home," he said. Grace looked out the window. "Then I am certain there has been some misunderstanding." Daniel smiled gently. "There has not." A few minutes later, the car passed through elegant iron gates and followed a tree-lined driveway, leading to a beautiful stone estate overlooking the lake. The property reflected quiet sophistication rather than excess. Fresh flowers lined the garden paths, and several employees were tending the grounds with obvious pride. What surprised Grace most was how Vincent greeted each gardener and groundskeeper by name as he walked across the terrace carrying 2 cups of coffee himself. He was not surrounded by assistants or security issuing instructions. He simply looked like a man welcoming a guest into his home. "Miss Carter," he said with a warm smile. "Thank you for coming." Grace nodded respectfully. "Thank you for inviting me, sir." Vincent gestured toward a breakfast table overlooking the water where fresh fruit, warm biscuits, eggs, and coffee had already been prepared. "Please," he said, "sit. Today you are my guest, not an employee." Grace hesitated only briefly before taking her seat. Throughout the meal, Vincent asked simple questions that no employer had ever cared to ask. He wanted to know where she grew up, what books she enjoyed reading, how she had learned to remain so calm under pressure, and what dreams she had quietly set aside while working to support herself. Grace answered honestly, though she remained modest. She explained that her mother had raised her to believe that every honest job deserved respect, and that kindness should never depend on whether someone could repay it. Vincent listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he rested his coffee cup on the table. "Do you know why I asked you here?" Grace smiled politely. "I assumed it was to thank me." Vincent shook his head. "I have already thanked you." He looked across the peaceful lake before continuing. "Years ago, my mother worked as a housekeeper. She cleaned offices after everyone had gone home. Most people never learned her name. Some believed her uniform defined her worth." Grace remained completely still, sensing how personal those memories were. "She used to tell me that the easiest way to judge a person's character was to watch how they treated someone who could do nothing for them." Vincent smiled faintly. "I have never forgotten those words." Grace felt a quiet emotion settle in her heart. Suddenly the events at the gala made perfect sense. Vincent had not stepped forward because she worked for him or because he wanted to prove his influence. He had stepped forward because he had once watched someone he loved carry the same invisible burdens with the same quiet dignity. After breakfast, Vincent stood and walked a few steps toward the edge of the terrace. Grace joined him, looking out over the still water, reflecting the clear blue sky. "Miss Carter," Vincent said calmly, "the city has enough people who know how to build successful businesses. What it needs are more people who remind others what integrity looks like. I would like to offer you an opportunity that has nothing to do with housekeeping and everything to do with the person you have already become." Grace looked at him with genuine surprise, her heart suddenly racing as she realized this invitation had never been about breakfast at all. Grace stood quietly beside the terrace railing, searching Vincent's face for some sign that she had misunderstood his words, but his expression remained calm and sincere. She had spent years believing that opportunities belonged to people with impressive resumes, prestigious degrees, or influential families. No one had ever suggested that integrity itself could become a qualification. "I do not think I am the person you are looking for," she admitted gently. "I have cleaned rooms, served dinners, and polished floors. I have never managed a foundation or led an organization." Vincent smiled with quiet understanding. Skills can be taught. Character rarely can. He invited her into a sunlit library overlooking the lake, where shelves filled with well-worn books stretched from floor to ceiling. Family photographs rested beside framed awards, but Grace noticed something unusual. Many of the photographs showed Vincent standing beside cooks, drivers, maintenance workers, teachers, and volunteers instead of celebrities or politicians. "Those are the people who built everything I value," Vincent explained after noticing where she was looking. "Success has many faces, but it always rests on people who are willing to work with honesty when no one is applauding." He handed Grace a slim folder. Inside, she found plans for a new community initiative funded by the Moretti Foundation. The program would provide scholarships, career training, and emergency assistance for hospitality workers, janitors, caregivers, housekeepers, restaurant employees, and countless others whose work often went unnoticed despite keeping entire communities running every day. Grace slowly turned each page, surprised by the thoughtfulness behind every detail. "This is wonderful," she whispered. "It deserves someone with experience." Vincent nodded. "It does. That is why experienced professionals will handle the administration, legal work, and financial management." He paused before continuing. "What they cannot provide is credibility earned through lived experience. I want the people this program serves to see someone who understands their lives because she has lived them herself." Grace remained silent as those words settled into her heart. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next work schedule. Vincent continued, "Your responsibility would not be to run the business. It would be to remind everyone involved why the business exists." Grace looked down at the folder resting in her hands. "Why do you trust me after knowing me for such a short time?" Vincent answered without hesitation. "Because when everyone else protected their reputation, you protected another person's future. When people laughed at you, you refused to humiliate them in return. And when I gave you the chance to blame someone, you chose mercy instead." His voice remained steady. "People reveal who they are when they have nothing to gain. That night, you revealed exactly who you are." Grace felt her eyes grow warm, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being fully seen. She had never asked for recognition. She had only hoped her work mattered to someone. Outside, the gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers across the terrace while the lake reflected the bright afternoon sky. The peaceful scene seemed almost unreal compared with the painful memories of only a few days earlier. Grace carefully closed the folder and looked back at Vincent. "If accepting this position means helping people remember that every honest worker deserves respect," she said softly, "then I would be honored to try." Vincent extended his hand, not as a powerful businessman sealing an agreement, but as one person placing confidence in another. Grace accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude, unaware that the decision she had just made would soon inspire changes reaching far beyond the walls of the Moretti Foundation and into the hearts of people who had forgotten that dignity was the greatest investment any society could ever make. 1 year later, the grand ballroom looked almost identical to the night that had quietly changed 2 lives, yet everything that truly mattered had transformed. Crystal chandeliers still reflected warm light across polished marble floors. The orchestra still filled the room with elegant music, and distinguished guests still gathered beneath the towering ceilings. The difference was not in the decorations. It was in the people. Servers moved confidently through the ballroom, greeted by name instead of by title. Housekeepers were thanked as naturally as honored donors. Managers paused to ask employees whether they needed support before asking whether every table had been arranged correctly. Respect had become part of the culture instead of a performance reserved for special occasions. At the front of the ballroom stood Grace Carter, no longer wearing a housekeeping uniform, but a simple navy blue business suit that reflected the same quiet elegance she had always carried within herself. She had not changed who she was. She had only been given the opportunity to let the world see it. Behind her, a large screen displayed photographs from the Moretti Foundation's community initiative. Thousands of hospitality workers had completed professional training programs. Hundreds of families had received emergency assistance during difficult seasons. Scholarships had opened doors for young people whose parents spent their lives cleaning offices, serving meals, maintaining buildings, and caring for others without recognition. Every success story carried the same message. Dignity creates opportunity. Grace stepped toward the microphone, looking across a room filled with business leaders, volunteers, employees, and community partners. She smiled warmly before speaking. "A year ago, I believed the greatest goal was simply to do my job well, without becoming a burden to anyone else. I thought kindness meant staying silent whenever someone treated me unfairly. Then I learned something that changed my life forever. Respect is not something we earn by becoming important. It is something every human being deserves before importance ever enters the room." The ballroom remained perfectly still. Many people listening remembered the gala from the previous year. Some lowered their eyes, reflecting on choices they wished they could take back. Others smiled proudly at how far the city had come. Grace continued, The people who prepare our meals, clean our workplaces, answer our phones, and welcome us every day are not invisible. They are the reason our communities function. When we honor their dignity, we strengthen our own character. As warm applause filled the ballroom, Grace instinctively looked toward the back of the room. Vincent Moretti stood quietly beside the entrance, exactly where he had first noticed her 1 year earlier. He had deliberately chosen not to sit at the front. He applauded with everyone else, never asking for recognition and never interrupting the moment that belonged entirely to Grace. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded ballroom. No words were necessary. Both understood that true leadership was never about standing in the brightest light. It was about making certain someone else no longer stood alone in the shadows. As the evening came to a close, guests remained behind to speak with employees they once might have overlooked. Business owners exchanged ideas for creating more respectful workplaces. Young volunteers signed up to expand the foundation's programs into neighboring cities. One simple decision to defend another person's dignity had quietly become a movement far greater than either Grace or Vincent had imagined. Walking toward the exit beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, Grace paused for one final glance around the ballroom before stepping into the cool evening air with peaceful confidence. She no longer measured success by titles, salaries, or applause. She measured it by the number of people who would never again question their own worth, because someone had finally reminded them that every honest life carries equal dignity. And on that quiet evening, an entire city remembered what true respect looked like.